Okay, continuing from last time, just a quick review of what we were doing last time. We're dealing here with the overall description of human history from the standpoint of probably one of the most important variables in human history. And as we've said last time, the critical ratio that we're concerned with is, as we said, the presence of the Bnei Shem in the world versus his withdrawal or his absence, and in Hebrew it's the Gilui or his revelation versus his hester versus his concealment. When God created the world, He created first a world of chesron, or imperfection, meaning that even though He was the creator of the world, you see, you have to remember this, it's very, very important. You see, as I said this many times, you all think that the big problem is, where is God? Mankind for the last thousands of years have been searching about the question, where is God? Who is God? So we think that the big problem that we have is to find God. But that's not the problem. That's the problem from our standpoint. The greater problem is God's problem. Because it's God's problem in the sense that His problem is, how do I hide? We think it's a problem of finding Him. He's got a much greater problem, Kavayoko. How do I hide? How do I, who am the source of all existence, who am existence Himself, how do I hide? How do I hide from that which I'm making? How is it possible to create something and in some way not show that I am the creator? You know what a problem that is? That's like Beethoven composing the Fifth and trying to fool you that it was never composed by a human being. How is that possible? Like it's by accident. That's the problem that God really faces. And the way He resolved it, in essence, by creating a reality which in some way reflects His existence and in other ways does not. How do you know it does not? Because if we did, we wouldn't have that problem of where is He? We wouldn't have the possibility of an atheist or agnostic. Which means that God created a reality of some sort where He withdrew. And this is an enormous, enormous problem. I can't begin to tell you, you see, you've got to look at it from God's eyes. For an absolute existence to withdraw from a certain reality which He creates is a very, very difficult thing. The world in which He created, which is the world of Adam Rishon, is that world. But the Bnei Shem wanted to create a world like this so that Adam, the first man, would find Him, and by finding God, by bringing Him back into the world, he would then acquire eternity. Now this is the whole thing, this is the whole trick. How does Adam find God? How does he find Him? He finds Him by submitting to one of the mitzvahs, by not eating from the eighth das of the law, by forcing, by intellectually understanding and emotionally that God is the absolute source of all creation, and by adhering to His will. When he does that in his heart, what happens is that he forces God back into reality itself, because the substance of existence itself changes. God created the substance of reality, or the substance of matter, in such a way where the presence of spirituality is no longer evident. When man forces God back into his mind, then the Bnei Shem returns into substance itself. He returns into matter. So that suddenly the world no longer is a barrier to spiritual substance, to spirituality, but that a person can literally see the spiritual world while he's in his body. That's the whole trick. That's called zichor, or the purification of the body. You see, that's what the Bnei Shem wants Adam to do. The Bnei Shem says to Adam, I'm giving you the power to do a mitzvah. That I'm going to give you a special kedusha where you can change the substance of the world, and you can remove the substance of the world as a barrier to me. And suddenly you become aware of me. It's not that I was hiding. I'm really there. But I put a very thick, dark filter over your eyes, so you can't see me. Do what you have to do, and I will remove that filter, and suddenly you will realize that I was here all the time. And the reason why you didn't see me is because I put you in a world which clouded your vision. a lens which was dark and didn't allow you to see me fully. But you can change that lens. So the function of Adam was what's called a tikkun of the chassan, to remove the chassan, or the imperfection in the world. Now, how much did God withdraw in that world? Not much. He didn't have to withdraw much. God is not interested in creating a world where he's completely gone. He's not interested in that. He wants to create a world where he's a little gone. That's all, just enough to make a difference. And he says to man, bring me back. So the presence-absence ratio, or the Gilu-Hester ratio, is quite large. The presence of God is 9, let's say, and his absence is 1. Now that's not a world of today. That's the world of Adam before he sinned. We have no idea what kind of world was that. As I once told you what the Gemara says basically, is that world, Adam was on the same level, or was able to see spirituality just like your souls are able to see after it leaves its body. That's what he was like while he was in his body. Could you imagine what kind of world that is? Could you imagine how subtle his goof was, or his body? How clear spirituality was to him? So you may say, if it was so clear to him, what was the test? Because God withdrew a little bit, enough to make it a test. After Adam sinned, then what happened? We went to the second stage. He introduced something called kilkul. Now what's kilkul? Kilkul is what? Is the disintegration or the degeneration of matter even further, so that it comes to an even heavier barrier. The presence-absence ratio was changed even further. It is no longer 9 to 1. Maybe it's now 8 to 2. You see? It's 8 to 2. So that after Adam Rishon sinned, it was much more difficult now to what? To become aware of God. But something else happened. Once Adam sinned, he damaged the physical world. He damaged his body and the physical world, so that no longer could he remove the effects of the chassan. No longer could he elevate the physical world so that the spiritual world is now seen. He couldn't. What he had to do now was involved in a new process called the tikkun of the kilkul. He had to remove the damage that he did to the physical world first. That removal is called the tikkun of the kilkul, or tahara, purification. This was a critical task of Adam. As I said, what he did was he introduced the tumah, or the power of evil, into the world itself. And because he did that, Adam had to die, as all things. He introduced death into the world. And I went into this a lot before, I'm not going to go into this now, the concept of death, and how it was connected with the sin of Adam. But that was the essential thing he did. He introduced the force of evil into the substance of the physical world itself, so that the physical world not only now was a barrier to the existence of God, but it could not even be transformed anymore. He was 2 steps away. The process now was the removal of that kilkul, or that tumah, or zoma. These are all the same words. How does he remove that tumah? He removes it 3 ways. The essential way that he removes it is if he remains steadfast to the mitzvahs while he's in the darkness. While man is living in the darkness of his kilkul, the darkness of the damage that he did to the world, and he still keeps the mitzvahs. If he keeps the mitzvahs in the darkness in which he created, by doing that, he begins to dispel that darkness itself and that tumah. That's where it's at. Or he can do tshuva. Or rather, let me go back to this. I've made this point many times before. Let me briefly say. As we have said, when man fails to do a mitzvah, the kedusha, or the power that he should have gotten, instead goes to the Satan. That Satan takes that kedusha and makes the world darker. If you want to know why the world gets darker when we sin, it's because we in essence give the power to the Satan to make the world darker. So the darkness of the world is a reflection of our sin. Every time we sin, collectively the world gets darker. What does it mean by darker? God hides more and more, he withdraws. and the presence of spirituality or the presence of truth in the world becomes further and further distant. Why? Because God allows the Satan or the evil force dominion over the world. The more we sin, the more power is given to him, the more he's able to darken the world and conceal the presence of God. When we keep the mitzvahs in that darkness, what we do is we pull back that power from the Satan, and by pulling it back from him, we bring the world higher again. You see, it's got this two-directional system. When we sin, we make the world darker, because the world now has our kedusha, and with our kedusha it becomes darker. If we do mitzvahs, we take back that light, and the world becomes lighter. So in essence, it's up to us, and it's our kedusha which is affecting the situation. So the main primary way in which we can remove this darkness and remove the damage is what's called omeid b'nesoyin. If we sustain ourselves in the test of that darkness, if we withstand, if we withstand the seduction of that darkness, because what's the quality of that darkness? And this is what you have to understand. That darkness is simply not a darkness of light, but it's much more subtle. What the darkness is as follows. It is a greater seductive force away from God. What it is the kedusha of God being used against his existence. The Satan is taking the power of our neshamas and the power of God and seducing us with that power to go away from God. That's the essence of that darkness. You see, look around you. America, the land of the free, the land of the prophet, F-I-T, P-R-O-F-I-T, the land of money. What do I mean? That's America. America is the land of material wealth. Where is all this material wealth coming from? Where is it coming from? The answer is it's coming from our kedusha. When the Jews sin collectively, the kedusha that should go into that nation goes over to the goyim. As we've said, they take that kedusha and they build their culture with it. That kedusha goes into their neshamas, and they have the ability to build a very great culture, a culture which is very great in both wealth and knowledge. And then suddenly the Jews look and they say, wait a minute, look at these goyim, look how smart they are, look how rich they are, look how powerful they are, let's follow them. But what the Jews don't understand is that wealth and that power and that knowledge is their own kedusha in the hands of the goyim. That's what they don't understand. Now if the Jews withstand it, if they understand it, that they're running after their own kedusha in the wrong hands. You see, if they withstand it, then they take back the kedusha and achieve a removal of the kilkul. So if they remain steadfast, if they're omeid b'nesoyin, if they stand in the test, while they're in the darkness itself. Why in the darkness? It means if they withstand the seductive power of that darkness. Because darkness means a greater seduction. That's what darkness means. It means a greater seduction away from God. That's what it means, darkness. It is not physical darkness. It is spiritual darkness that we're concerned with. And what is spiritual darkness? Spiritual darkness means the possibility or the option of going away from God because there's something better somewhere else. That's what spiritual darkness is. If we deny the power of that darkness, the seductive power of that darkness, we put away the power of it, and it begins to disintegrate. Or we could do tshuva. We can repent for our sins. If we repent for our sins and we attempt to establish ourselves again we pull away what? The kedusha from the Satan, and we bring it back to ourselves. Finally, if we don't do that, then God then comes down and punishes us by yisurin, by punishments. And if he has to do it that way, it's very painful. But punishment which is brought on us also allows us to take back the kedusha that we gave away through our sins. So these are the three ways that we can achieve the tahara, three ways that we can achieve the purification, or undo the damage of sin, or the consequences of that sin. If we succeed then we will restore the world back to a new phase. We will restore the world back to a ratio where the presence, absence, or Gilui Hester ratio is again 9 to 1. You see, because we will destroy that darkness in the world. And what will happen? We will simply have a world which is left with the minimal barrier as it exists in the time of Adam Rishon. Remember, when it first started out with Adam Rishon, the world was imperfect, but it wasn't damaged. It was imperfect. It was what's called Chassan. The sin of Adam Rishon brought in the evil into the world and damaged it. So it's 2 steps down. We have to remove the damage, and if we remove the damage, we go back to the world of imperfection, or Chassan. Essentially, we restore the world back to the time of Adam. You see. And we've got to do again what Adam failed to do. Now, what is that called? What is the period of time called when we restore the world back to the time of Adam? To that level of Adam. That's called the Messianic period of the Yemot Mashiach. If you never knew what it is, that's what it is. The Messianic period is nothing more than the restoration of reality as it once existed in the time of Adam, where the ratio is again restored to what that was. But that cannot be achieved until first the kilkel is removed through these methods that I described. Now, from what I'm saying, it would seem that the following is a sequence of events. First, the condition of the world is called chassan, or imperfection. When Adam sinned, the condition of the world was not only chassan, but also kilkel, or damage. When we restore ourselves to the Messianic period, we go back to the condition called chassan, or imperfection, because we remove the damage or kilkel. And finally, in Olam Haba, there's a complete removal of the chassan, where there's no imperfection at all. The ratio is now 10 to 0. So the presence of God is now totally restored. From this diagram, you see, what I'm saying, it looks like once Adam sinned, once Adam sinned, and his children sinned, and they sinned, then mankind is continuously involved in a process of kilkel. It's continuously involved in the process of sin. And since they're always sinning, they can't get back to what they were originally, to what Adam was originally, to go from step 2 to step 1. Everyone is constantly involved in going to step 3 to step 2, you see. If the next generation right after Adam had not sinned, they would have gone from step 2 to step 1. Or rather, they would have gone from step 3 to step 2, you see. They would have been in this situation of imperfection, chassan. But what it is every generation keeps on going down from 2 to 3, 2 to 3, 2 to 3, constantly. And we're always at number 3. Always at number 3. So we can never get back to number 2. What is number 2 and 3? We are always in kilkel, so we cannot get back to chassan. Chassan means imperfection. It is a minor absence of God. Kilkel is a major absence of God, where the ratio is significantly altered. Adam started out in chassan. We've got a big problem. He started chassan and he wound up in kilkel. We constantly are involved in kilkel because we're always sitting, so we can never get back to chassan. If we can get back to chassan, we'd be by the Messianic period, you see, which is a time of only chassan and no kilkel, and then we go to Olam Haba, where there is no more chassan. You see how that works? Okay. Now, is this an actual sequence of events that occurs? Not really. It is theoretical, but it's not actual. Why not? Because what this says is the following. You start on chassan, and what you're supposed to go is from chassan to what's called shleimus. Shleimus means perfection. Shleimus is a world where the presence-absence ratio is 10 to 0. Sholem means perfect, or whole, complete. The whole object is to go from chassan to shleimus. Adam should have gone from this to this. Instead, of going to Shlemus, he instead went to Kilkul. He went down. Now, it would seem that what we have to do now is to go back from Kilkul to Chasson, and then from Chasson back up to Shlemus. We've got to go back up, you see. So the implication is that after the sin of Adam, mankind has been continuously involved in the process of removing the Kilkul. And that finally when he removes the Kilkul, he will go back to the condition of Chasson, and from there he will attempt to go back up again to Shlemus. So we talk about what's called consecutive processes. First Chasson, then remove the Kilkul, and then go back to the Chasson, and then go up to the Shlemus. It's consecutive, one after the other, you see. You start out with Chasson, you should go to Shlemus. If you don't, if you go down to Kilkul. Well, in order to get back up to Shlemus, you've got to go back to Chasson, and then back up to Shlemus. But it all sounds like it's consecutive, one after the other. But the truth of the matter is, it's not consecutive. It's not consecutive at all. The truth of the matter is, it is simultaneous. After the sin of Adam, or rather when Adam was first created, he was only involved in the process of Chasson. He was only involved in the process of removing that minimal barrier which was between him and the presence of God. Once he sinned, and the world went down to a level of Kilkul, he now had to go into a new process, called the removal of the Kilkul. But what happened to the old process of Chasson? What happened to the old process? How does one remove the Chasson? How? If Adam would have done the mitzvah, he would have brought down a spiritual power into his neshama. That spiritual power would have allowed him to transform reality. So he would have acquired a new power, the acquisition of power, by bringing it down from heaven. Once he sins, that power goes into the hands of the Satan, who then can make the world darker. So if you want to take away that power, you have to take that power back from the Satan. So there are essentially two directions in which you take that spiritual power. Either you bring it down, or you bring it back. You bring it down when you do a mitzvah, and if you do a sin, it goes to the Satan. Once it's in the hands of the Satan, you've got to bring it back. You see. There are two directions to the acquisition. Either you bring it down, or you bring it back. Back meaning from the Satan, or the darkness. When Adam sinned, then the power that he should have had went to the Satan. After he sinned, he had to bring that power back, you see. But in addition to bringing that power back, he was also involved in bringing more light down. So therefore, what was happening was two processes going on at the same time. He was bringing Kedusha down, and he was bringing light back from the Satan, from both directions. At the same time, he was involved in removing the Chasson by bringing light down, so he was building up a treasury of power to eventually transform the world, and he was also taking the light back from the world, from the Satan, so that what? So that he was removing the damage which he did to the reality. So he was really involved in two processes at the same time, not one. It was a simultaneous process. He was involved in fixing or removing the damage, and also in fixing the imperfection at the same time. That's why the real state of affairs after the sin was, he was involved in the tikkun of the kilkul, or the removal of the damage, and the tikkun of the chasson, or the removal of the barrier. Both are really going on at the same time. Both. Both are going on at the same time. When Adam sins, a part of that light goes to the Satan, but not all of it. Part of it still remains up, so that he can bring further parts down. You see. In essence, what we're saying is that he's involved in building up his kedusha, or spirituality. from two different directions at the same time. He wants to undo the damage that he did to physical reality, to the world, so that the world's physical substance becomes capable of being transformed. And at the same time, he wants to bring down more power, so that when the world loses its damage, he can then go ahead and actually transform it. He's involved in both of these things at the same time. The sin of Adam, what the sin of Adam essentially did was take a certain amount of that power and used it to actually damage physical reality itself. That power has to be removed from the Satan, so that the damage to physical reality is restored. But he still needs power to transform it. And that is an additional power that he has to do with mitzvahs. So in essence, what he's doing by keeping the mitzvahs, when a person keeps the mitzvahs, you see, is he's achieving both things at the same time. He's removing the impurity which exists in the physical world. He's removing the kilkul, and he's also bringing down new power, which will allow him to transform the world once that kilkul or damage is removed. There's a two-step process. Now what will happen? What happens after he finishes removing all the damage? Then the messianic period appears, doesn't it? Yes. Because once all the damage, all the kilkul, all the damage he did to the physical world is done, to his body and to his soul and to the world is gone, he now raises the world to a higher level, you see. But the question is the period, the messianic period, which comes after he removes the kilkul, is that the same as the period before he even sinned? Is it the same? And if not, how is it different? Based on what I said, the messianic period will not be the same as the period before Adam sinned. It will be slightly different. But how will it be different? Let's look at it again. Adam was created in a world of imperfection. It was his job to go up to a world of perfection. Instead, he went down to a world of damage. Now, logically, what would Adam have to do? Basically, after he sinned, he went down to a world of damage. Now, what we say logically is, wait a minute, in order to get back to perfection, he's got to go back up to imperfection, and from imperfection, further up to perfection. You see. But instead, what's happening is that while he's down here in the world of damage, while he's down, he's also involved in removing the imperfection. At the same time, while he's removing the damage, he's also involved in also taking away some of the imperfections. So by the time he gets back up here, he will be higher than he was before. In other words, the messianic period is greater than the period of Adam before he sinned. It is greater. Because not only will it no longer have any damage, just like Adam had before he sinned, but in addition, it will also have accomplished a great deal of what? Of the removal of imperfection. You see. So that even though the world of the Messianic period, the time of the Messianic period, will not be a perfect world, yet, it will be much more perfect than it was when Adam started. Why? Because when Adam started, he didn't do anything. Adam had one mitzvah. Did Adam ever do one mitzvah? No. Adam never did one mitzvah. Because as soon as Adam started, right away he sinned. So he never had the ability of even doing one mitzvah before he damaged the world. Hence, the world as it existed in the time of Adam had no correction of imperfection at all. All he did was damage it. He didn't do anything to remove the imperfection. But now that he's involved in the damage, now that he's involved in removing the damage, him and his children, in all the generations of mankind, are involved in removing the damage and also removing the imperfection at the same time, then we're doing more than what Adam did before he sinned. Because we're doing two things at once. So that when the Messianic period appears, and it will only appear after the damage, we will already have acquired a substantial amount of the removal of imperfection. You see.
So he actually did something good.
What essentially it means is the following. The Messianic period, because of the fact that we will have removed the damage and also removed a great deal of the imperfection, will be a period where the ratio of presence to absence, or Gila Hesed, will be greater than it was in the time of Adam. Because we will also have removed a great deal of the Chassan, or imperfection, so that the presence of God will be much higher in the Messianic period than it was at the time of Adam. But it's still a ways to go to get to Olam Haba. If Adam had not sinned at all, he would have instantly achieved a 10-0 ratio. You see, if Adam had not sinned at all, then he would have gone from imperfection to perfection, which is 10-0, right away. Instead, he went down. Now we are trying to undo that damage. As we undo that damage, we are also removing the chasson at the same time, so that when we get to the point when the damage is clear, we will not only have cleared the damage, but we will also have established a great deal towards the goal of perfection. You see, we will not have achieved it totally, because we're not at the point of Olam Haba, but we will have gotten there to a large extent, much more than Adam did before he sinned. So therefore the revelation, or the presence of God, the ability of the spiritual awareness in the time of the Mashiach, will be greater than it was in the time of Adam, even before he sinned. Do we understand this? This is a very unusual thing. Yes, it's a quirk. It's a very strange quirk, in a way. Because we thought that all we're trying to do is to get back to the level of Adam. You see. The truth of the matter is that we're going to be higher than Adam was. You see. Now you may say, well, that's good. That's not good. Because if Adam had not sinned, he would have been there right away. He would have achieved the ultimate goal right away. You see. But what God allows us to do, is to continue to work at both goals at the same time. And by working at both goals at the same time, when the Messianic period does arrive, we will be on a much higher level. If Adam had not sinned, mankind would not have existed the way we know it. It sounds strange. It does. Mankind would have been a different entity. He would have had children, but his children would not have been independent from him the way we are from him. You see, they would have been much more connected to what he did. They would have been more like offshoots of him. But what it is since Adam sinned, his children go on to be their own separate people entirely, with their own task and their own reward and punishment, separate from him. If Adam had not sinned, then his children in some way, which is not clear to me, would have been much more connected to him and what he achieved. You see. How many children would he have had? He would have had a number of things, but what happened, he would have had 3 children, and those 3 would have had 12, and those 12 would have had 70, and those 70 would have had 600,000, and it would have stopped at that point. In other words, from Adam would have arisen 600,000 offshoots of him, in some way spiritually connected to him. You see. That's what would have materialized. But because he sinned, then everything that transpired produced a mankind where each person is now on his own, has to do his own thing and correct the damage that he did, and every generation has to correct the damage of the generation before, because every generation is connected to the ones before in some way. So as mankind goes further and further and does more and more damage, we have to constantly become involved in the removal of the kilkel, constantly, you see. And the way we're involved is that each generation then fragments further and further and further, so that each generation is constantly trying to undo the damage that it did when it was in the form of the previous generation. You see. Do we understand how that goes? Every generation is a reflection and a part of the one before. It's not new. You think that every generation is new, you see. But there's a fundamental belief in Judaism, a fundamental principle of reincarnation, you see. But what you have, it's not so much reincarnation, it's more fragmentation, you see. If you have a certain generation like Adam, one man, he sinned, so now his neshama is fragmented. And that fragmentation now produces more people. But each of those people is separate from Adam, and now a new individual. If that generation fails to achieve the task and they produce more damage, you see, then what happens is those souls are further fragmented. And they become people who now must fix up, you see, further damage. Now you may say, well, why should they have to fix up the damage that was done by the previous generation? The answer is that that new generation was the previous generation in a different form, you see. Mankind is constantly shifting. Individuals are constantly shifting and expanding in different ways. Constantly to undo the damages, but every time that we have to undo damage, we go further and further into history. There are more and more people. Just to give an example, let's say, for example, you have a certain generation, in generation 1, okay? Generation 2 and generation 3. Okay? Let's say we have 3 generations. In generation 1, okay, we have one neshama, one soul. When that soul fails to do it, then what happens is that soul is then divided. The part of that soul which is damaged then becomes an independent soul in this generation. So you now have 2 souls. If this soul, for example, doesn't achieve what it's supposed to do, then it becomes 2 souls. You see? So in essence, what happens is each neshama, as it fails to do what it's supposed to do, divides, so that now 2 people must do what that one soul should have done. That one soul, which was one person, now becomes 2. You see? And that's how it essentially happens. That's how you can start off with one man and now wind up with billions of people. You see? Because all these billions of people one day belonged to Adam Rishon alone. You see? And all the millions of people belong to, all the billions of people once belonged to millions of people, and those millions belong to thousands, and those thousands belong to tens. You see what I'm saying? In that order. So that each generation is a reflection of the ones before it. There's a very critical principle you have to understand that you're asking, that you have to enlighten everyone on. It's very, very important. It's the essence of what really is going on and the whole problem in creation. God sets out with a certain objective. You see. What happens if that objective is not met? Let's say it's not met. Then what? So you may say, well, then the Rebbeinu will change the objective. Or switch around the situation. Or whatever have you. Or ignore the objective. But that's not really what it is. If God sets out with a certain objective, that objective could never be altered. Never. Meaning, when the Rebbeinu started out, He created a person, and He said to the person, you earn your Olam Haba. You earn it. I give you a chance to earn it. What happens if Adam doesn't earn it? Then it's over. Essentially, that chance has been used, and it's over. You see, according to the law that He created the world itself, Adam cannot have the Kedusha, you see, unless he's earned it. Now, Adam is given a certain type of existence to get that Kedusha. And let me explain what I mean by the existence. It's very subtle. We all exist. We exist in a very interesting way. We can all change, can't we? We can grow. We can change. Now, I don't know if you know, that type of existence is very different than the existence in Olam Haba. In Olam Haba, existence will be such that there's no growth. You can't change anymore. It's static. That means that the way you exist now will not be the same as the way you exist in Olam Haba. Time itself will be different. Right now, you can change as a person in different ways. You can understand more. You can grow in understanding. You can grow in what? In sensitivity. You can grow in personality. You have the capacity to grow. That capacity is in the way you exist right now. But you will not always exist this way. There will come a time when you will exist without the ability to change. You will be what you will be as you have made yourself at that point forever. You will never be able to change again. Now, when God created a reality or a world which has the ability to change, what does that mean? It means that He had to construct something new. He had to construct reality or existence which can change in some way. Because existence by itself has no change. Existence is Whatever is. It doesn't change in any way. It is as it is. So what the Bonishim did was to create a new kind of existence. An existence where something can go from point A to point B. That itself was created. That never existed before. Why not? Because look at God. God cannot change. God is the beginning and end of everything. God is not capable of changing. God doesn't go from A to B. He doesn't get bigger or better or smarter. God is exactly as He started out. The way He started out is the way He winds up. He's always the same, because that's the nature of existence. Existence is. It's the same way at the beginning as at the end. There's no difference. When the Buddha wanted to make a world, and he decided to make man, and to give man the power to earn Olam Haba, he had to give man the ability to change his own existence, to make himself better, higher. But in order to do that, God had to create a new kind of existence, an existence that can go from A to B. You see, do we understand this? Which means that we were given what's called a dynamic existence. It's an existence which has the ability to move or change one moment from the next. That will be taken away from us at the end of the Messianic period. At the end of the Messianic period, we will then be given a new type of existence, where we never will be able to change again. Whatever we achieve to that point will become what we are permanently. Now, if God gives us the existence to go from A to B, He's got to give the existence the energy or the power to go from A to B. That means that when God created what's called a dynamic form of existence that can move up or change in some way, it has to have the power to change. So the power is what is included in the existence itself. It's contained in the existence. The existence not only can change, but it has the power to change. It can move from one thing to another. Do we all follow? When Adam was created, God said to him, I give you one mitzvah. With that mitzvah, you can go from A to B. Not only that, I give you the power to go from A to B. Now Adam was thinking, what should I do? Should I go to A? What should I do? Where should I go? And what happened was, the Buddha said the following. Adam was created at point A. Adam was created at point A. And God said to him, I want you to go from point A to point B. How will you go from point A to point B? If you keep the mitzvah and you attach yourself to me, your neshama will become much greater. It will go from A to B. But I want you to do it out of free choice. So I will seduce you, I will give you a test or a Yetzer Hara that will try to get you to move not in the direction of B, but in the direction of minus B. You see. So, I'm giving you a choice. You can either go in direction B or in direction minus B. One of the two directions. I will give you the kind of existence which can actually make that journey, and I will give you the power to make that journey. But I will give you that power only once. When Adam thought, which way would I go? And instead of going to B, which is Olam Haba, he went to minus B when he did the sin. What he did was, he used up the energy of his own existence. That's what happened. He used up the dynamic power in his existence to choose and transform the world. When he used it up, he was empty. It's like you take a spring. If you have a spring, right? If I condense it, what happens? If I push it down, if I compress it or contract it, it now has power in it, right? It can. If I let go, what happens? It jumps, you see. But it can only jump once. Once it jumps, it's over. So if it jumps in the wrong direction, it's lost. That's the same thing with Adam. Adam's existence was like a spring, and he was wound up so that he had the ability to move in a direction. When he failed to move in that direction, he lost his energy. That's why the immediate consequence of Adam should have been annihilation. That is what we mean by din, or justice. Din said, when Adam failed to do his mitzvah, the mitzvah din, or the attribute of justice said, destroy Adam, or annihilate him. That's what we mean by the attribute of justice, or din. Din is nothing more What Din said, when Adam failed to do his mitzvah, the Midas Din came down and said, hey, you see that guy? Annihilate him, destroy him. Why? Why? Again, when Adam failed to do his mitzvah, and he did a sin, what happened was, the attribute of justice came up to God and said, or the Satan came up to God and said, hey, you see that guy down there? He's a dead man. Annihilate him. Why? Because he did a chait. So we think that the attribute of justice comes to punish man. How? Because of a sin. But that's not really what goes on. The attribute of justice is no more than the description of his physical and complete system. Justice is nothing more than reality. That's all it is. It's the voice of reality. When Adam did his sin, Adam killed himself. How? Because he spent his energy. So the voice of Adam's reality said, it's all over. That's all the Satan said. The Satan didn't say anything that wasn't obvious from reality. Justice is nothing more than the voice of reality itself. It simply says what is going on, or what has happened. You see, you think that it's someone running up there to accuse you. It is that. But fundamentally, the power of the accusation of the Satan is simply nothing more than his ability to observe reality and say, this is what's happened. That's all it is. It is reality which destroys you. It is simply the Satan who simply recalls to God what the reality is. But it's the reality of what you've done to it that says you are now no longer. You see, it's very important to understand this. So therefore, Adam was supposed to be annihilated because his reality was over. He spent all his energy. So God now had a big problem. What do you do now? What do you do to a string that just jumped in the wrong direction? You see, but you understand now why we say he jumped in the wrong direction, you understand? Because it had to do with the energy of Adam, the energy of his choice, was wrapped up with the energy of his existence. It was the same thing. You see. So you think, well, give him another chance. Give him another chance. It's not that simple. Because the ability to choose freely, the ability to go in one direction as against another, is the ability to grow. The ability to grow is to have a certain kind of existence which has power in it. You see. The power is what gives you free will. If you use it wrongly, you've lost your power. It's over. Then what the Banisham must do is rewind you. How do you rewind someone? You can't rewind a person. It's not like a clock where you can rewind. You see the point? This was the problem that God faced when Adam sinned. It was a problem not of justice. It was a problem of reality. God now had to deal with a new reality. A reality where dynamic existence spends itself and can't go anymore. This is a critical problem of sin. How did God resolve it? He resolved it by the attribute of mercy. That's what we say. But what is the attribute of mercy? Now you begin to understand that mercy is much more difficult than you think. The attribute of mercy means that in some way God had to intervene or interfere with reality itself. That's what mercy is. Rahmanas or mercy is not simply God saying, I feel sorry for you, so I'll give you another chance. It's not so simple. Because when you have a chance to begin with, God must construct existence in a certain way to give you the chance. If you lose that chance, then you can't simply, God is not going to simply create a new world or a new existence. He could do that, but obviously Adam is gone. Adam is no longer a keeping the person. God now has to create a new world with a new Adam and so on and so forth. But the Banisham doesn't want to do it. The Banisham wants to give Adam another chance. But how can you give him another chance when his reality itself won't permit it anymore? That, the new way, or the manipulation of Adam's reality, so that Adam can have a second chance despite the fact that his reality does not allow it, that is called Rahmanas, or mercy. It's an intervention into the laws of reality itself. How did God do it? How did he intervene? And that answers your question. The way that God did it was to take the power that Adam spent and put it into the Satan. And by a certain mechanism which I will not go into now, it allows Adam to continue to exist even though he has no more energy. Even though Adam has no more energy technically, Because technically, Adam is on a heart-lung machine. He's really on a what? On a respirator. He's dead. For all practical purposes, Adam Rishon cannot breathe anymore. Not only Adam, his neshama can't breathe. All of mankind cannot breathe. So all of mankind, after he sinned, is right now in a respirator. You see, we are all in respirators. We are in spiritual respirators because we really don't have the energy inside to keep us going. Why does God want to keep us in a respirator? Because God wants to give us again the ability to remove the chesan. He doesn't want to let the kilkel or the damage destroy us. You see. So therefore he implies rachmanas or mercy. Mercy extends the life. It puts the guy in a respirator so that he can continue and eventually remove the chesan itself. That's what it does. How is it done? What is the nature of this respirator? We understand that the name of this respirator is mercy, or rachamim. Rachamim is the name of the respirator. But what is the mechanism of the respirator? The mechanism of the respirator is the following, is that when you do a sin, the world gets darker. And why does the world get darker? Because the power that you lost goes to the Satan. You see. Because as long as it goes to the Satan, it can go back to you. You can still use that energy in some way. While that Satan is connected to you, while that evil force is inside your neshama, while it's inside your body, it's in reality. By the Satan being connected to you and the power going to him, you are able to use it at the same time. You see? In other words, if your power goes back to heaven, you'll never get it again. But if your power goes into reality itself, it goes to the Satan, and God connects you with the Satan, so while he's connected to you, you can feed off him as he feeds off you. You see? So you continue to live. That's why the biggest mercy, the biggest rachmanas that God does is to what? Is to make the world darker. To let the Satan become more and more associated with reality. To let the fingers of evil become more and more prevalent in what the world is. Why? Because the Satan now contains the power which you've lost. And as he becomes associated or tied with you as your Siamese twin, as God allows the Satan to become a klipa or a shell around your neshama, you see, you may say, well, what's that for? Because now that the Satan is a shell around your neshama, and now that the Satan is in the world, and so on, you can borrow off of him, just like he's borrowing off you. You see, it's a double, it's what they call it, what, it's a double parasitic reaction, or it's a real symbiosis. But at least you can survive. In other words, if you fail to do what God does, who says, then what happens is you will lose the energy of choice. God must give you a what? He must give you a crutch. The name of that crutch is the Satan. And that's the mystery of what Rachmanis is about. It sounds strange, you see. But that's really what it is. If you understand what I'm saying now, you understand a very, very profound thing of what Rachmanis really is, what its objective is. The objective of Rachamim, or mercy, is to interact, is to intervene, interfere with the demands of reality, with the demands of what God created the world. And how does it interfere? By using the Satan as the crutch. We think that the world, when the world goes down to evil, when the world descends more and more to evil, that God is leaving the world, He's abandoning the world, you see. We think that as God, as evil takes over the world, as we see the Golos, as the Goyim get more and more mighty and the Jews get smaller and smaller, you see. And we see as the Orthodox Jews get smaller and smaller and the Torah gets weaker and weaker, and nobody's learning anymore, Torah, nobody's keeping mitzvahs anymore, and all you see is people out there to kill Jews, and you see Jews out there to kill other Jews, and so on. We say the world is in an incredible darkness, you see, that there's almost nothing left of spirituality. But the fact of the matter is that that is what is saving the world. What is saving the world is the darkness. That is the greatest mystery of all. The greatest mystery of all is that God saves mankind in the world through the power of evil itself. Strange, isn't it? Strange, because you think that evil is antagonistic, but it is evil, which is the power of redemption, you see. That is the Hanogas HaYichud. Right. To those who remember the Hanukkah Yichud. The Hanukkah Mishpat is God's attribute of justice. It is the Hanukkah Mishpat, or the conduct of God's justice, that said Adam should die. The Hanukkah Mishpat is identical to reality. That's all. It's simply the demands of reality. The Hanukkah Yichud, or the attribute of God's oneness, or God's absolute power, attempts to save the world. But that's why it's called Yichud. Why? One. Yichud means one. The Hanukkah Yichud, which is really the better name for Rachman, is the fact that God saves the world through His unity. What does that mean, His unity? That God says, I am different than you. To you, there's good and there's evil. There's black and there's white. And you think that good is good and evil is evil. You see, when something bad happens to you, if a pain happens to you, or something negative happens to you, or sorrow, some obstacle, or some problem, you think that it's bad, you see. Because that's how you see it. Because you see the world through the eyes of justice. But I see the world through the eyes of what all existence. And I tell you that the problems in your life, and the suffering that you have, and the obstacles and the difficulties, and the darkness which descends on mankind, that is your redemption. You can't understand that because you don't understand the mechanism. But God says, I will save the world because only I, who is beyond existence, can use evil to bring good. That's an incredible absurdity. How can you take something which is totally evil, and in the end come out with a good objective? Evil is evil, and good is good. But the Buddhism says, I can. Because I am the foundation of all existence. And there is no evil before me. Evil is simply the mechanism in which I'm using to remove the dictates of reality. But to you it's called evil. To me it's called salvation or redemption. Right now you cannot see it, but in the time of Mashiach you will understand what I did. You will understand that when I tied the Satan to you, and while the Satan was tied to you, he kept on banging you over the head because he was tied to you. You will also understand that as he was hitting you, at the same time you were alive because he was your crutch. He was your respirator. He was your wheelchair. Because you were using the power which he had to keep alive. You see. That's the ultimate thing. The ultimate thing is that God saves the world because he hides. When the Baruch says, in the day that you sin, I will withdraw more and more. So we look at the withdrawal of God as the increase of that ratio of presence to absence, as a sign of greater and greater darkness, as a sign of greater and greater withdrawal, you see. As a sign of the further and further we go away from the truth, so we think that we're lost, abandoned. But we're not, because it is the ratio, it is the alteration of that ratio which is our salvation. That's why that ratio is critical. You see, if that ratio remained the same, Adam started off with 9 to 1. The sin of Adam demanded that suddenly becomes 0-0. You see. So what the Baruch says, no, let's make it 8 to 2, 7 to 3, 6 to 4. Let me hide more and more. But when I hide more and more, how can I hide? How does God hide? The way God hides is by allowing darkness to come into the world. And he hides behind the darkness. Darkness comes into the world to restore the power which is constantly being lost by men. That is the ultimate mechanism of Hanukkah Yichud, or of what we call Rachman. And it's one of the deepest things of all. It's one of the deepest things. Very few people understand its mystery or its secret. You see, even what I'm saying over here is one infinitesimal of what the secret of that mechanism is. You see, it is extraordinarily deep. I mean, in advanced human, we would go much more into that mechanism. But right now, suffice to understand what justice really is, you see, and what mercy really is. And that it's not easy for God to be a Meracham. You think it's, well, just overlook it. It's not. Because for God to overlook, what you did is for God to overlook his own existence which he made, the laws in which he built the reality itself. You see, God had to build a dynamic existence to give man free will. You see. But once man has free will, man can use the power for nothing. So what is God supposed to do? He had to give man the power, and man lost it. So what's he supposed to do? Man is going to come crying to him, give me back my power? I gave you the chance. What do you want? I built it into the fabric of your existence. You see. So man says to Bunisham, yes,
But you are a God greater than the God of justice. You are higher than reality. You see, you can be Maven Midoisach. You can go beyond your own midas, your own attributes. There's something that you have which is even beyond. You see, where do you see this? Where do you see that God uses these two criteria? The criteria of reality and the criteria of transcending reality, to go beyond it. You see it in Ashrei. You see it in the Vayetzi Pasuk. And I'd like to just show you the Pasuk very clearly. You see it every day in Ashrei. Tzadik Hashem b'chol duachol. Tzadik Hashem. God is a tzadik. He's a righteous one. B'chol, in all duachol, in all of his ways. The word duachol comes from the word derech. Derech means a path, or a procedure, or a manner, a rule. God is a tzaddik in all of his ways. In all the things that God, in all of his ways, God is a tzaddik. He's totally righteous. V'chassid, but he is a chassid. B'chol ma'asav. But in all of his actions, or all of his deeds, he is a chassid. Now let's look at this. What is the difference between a tzaddik and a chassid? A tzaddik is somebody who follows the letter of the law. He is a righteous person. A chassid is someone who goes beyond the letter of the law. He goes beyond the letter of the law. He's higher than a tzaddik. You see, he fulfills even beyond where it is even not required. He's a chassid. Okay. What's the difference between a derech and a maisa? A derech is a path. But fundamentally a derech is the way in which you should go. It's the right way. You see, it's the way which is appropriate. It's the essential way that reality says, this is what's right. Myself, a maser, is an action. It has nothing to do with what's right and wrong. It has to do with what you do. What do you actually do? So, let's look at the plus again. Tzadik Hashem b'chol duachol. God is a tzaddik. When it comes to the ways of God, he's a tzaddik. God is righteous. What does it mean? God built the world of reality as a tzaddik, with justice. The way of God was to construct the world with a certain reality. He would give man a certain power. That power gives him the ability of free will. Okay? In other words, when it comes to the actual, what God created, or the reality, or the principles which govern the world, his dvochim, he's a tzaddik. God created the world by the strict rule of justice, or law, cause and effect. But what happens if man fails? What happens if he fails? You see, then man should be annihilated. So then God cannot behave as a strict ruler, a strict judge. Instead, when it comes to what God actually does, he's a chassid. He has to overlook what man did. You see? He's a chassid. In other words, when it comes to what God instills in the world, when it comes to when it comes to the creative facet of God, to what he created, his method or his procedure, he's a judge. Reality is what's key. But when it comes to what's going to happen in the end, when it comes to what God has to do to save the world, he's a chassid. He's someone who goes beyond the rule of justice or cause and effect. And therefore what he does, what he actually winds up doing, you see, is that he's a chassid. This is the rule of justice. Tzadik Hashem b'chol duachol is the rule of justice. Chassid b'chol ma'asav is the rule of what? Of mercy. This Tzadik Hashem b'chol duachol is the hanagas ha-mishpat. Chassid b'chol ma'asav is the hanagas ha-yichud. But what does it all mean? What does it mean? It means that reality says you got one chance, because your existence gives you one chance. That's what reality says. But God doesn't want to destroy man, even if he fails to use it, so then God must in the end become a chassid. He has to deal with man above the laws of reality. When man expends the power of the jump, when he loses the energy of the free will, God has to intervene and save him. Now, this pasuk does not say here how he does it. All it simply says is that he does it. You see. How does he do it? How does God do it? Eis tzorah Yaakov umimenu yivishea. What's the pasuk? Let's translate it. Eis tzorah. It is a time of trouble. It is a time of great worries, of problems. It is a time of what? Of of great struggle, the time of sorrow, of misfortune. It is. Eis Tzorehi Yaakov. It is a time of great misfortune for Yaakov. Who is Yaakov? Jews. Because they're called the children of Yaakov. That's what it says. It is a time of great misfortune for the Jews. Umimena, and from that misfortune, God saves them.
If you turn around the word sorry,
Please,
find it there.
please wait. Again, Eis Tzorehi Yaakov. It is a time of great misfortune for the Jews. Umimena, and from that misfortune, Yivoshea, they will be saved. God will save them from that misfortune. That's one way of reading it. In other words, what does God do? Who saves us from the misfortune? God saves us from the misfortune. But there's another way to read it which is more accurate. Eis Tzorehi Yaakov. It is a time of troubles for who? For the Jews. Umimena, you see, from the misfortune itself, Yivoshea. It is the Torah, it is the misfortune itself which will save us. It is the darkness. It is the catastrophe. It is the destruction. It is the churban. It is the exile. It is the sickness. It is the disease. That will be our salvation. It's not that God is going to save us from that, but that itself will save us. The imimena doesn't refer to God, but it refers to the misfortune itself. You see. In other words, what it is the following. Is that the ultimate salvation that we have is from the Torah. That is the salvation. Lie buried deep inside the Torah itself is the seeds of redemption, but we can't see it.
You have it in the Word.
There's a very, very deep mystery in here, and it's very important to understand this from every angle. We are Jews. We look at the world and we see that historically we are at our nadir. We are at the lowest point. There was a time we were at Har Sinai, we received the Torah, we were at the highest point. From that time, it's been a steady trip down. We've gone from exile to exile, from darkness to darkness, so that there's very little left of us today. And we think that we are at the bottom point. But the fact of the matter is that in our darkness, in our lowest point, that is what will allow us to one day usher in the Messianic period. It is the darkness itself which contains the seed of the redemption. You see. And that's the greatest miracle of all. The Goyim are going to turn around and say, wait a minute, 1 second. We were the mightiest people on earth and you were the smallest. You see. And then suddenly one day they're going to turn around and they see suddenly the Jews are on top and they go on the bottom. And they're going to say, it doesn't make sense. How is it possible that we were on top, you were on the bottom, and now suddenly it's reversed? And the explanation is the following. Because you were never really on top. You thought you were on top. Why did you think you were on top? You thought you were on top because it looked like we were on the bottom. But the truth is, we were never on the bottom. Because when we were in darkness, and we were in exile, it was simply a darkness which covered us. But all the time, we were slowly going to the top, and we were always on top. You see, we disguised ourselves with exile. The king disguised his crown by putting on a dark robe. You see. So suddenly, the slave thought that he was king, because the king hid his crown. But the king simply merely uncovers the robe, and he sees, I'm king. And then the slave realizes that he was never king to begin with. He was always a slave. And it was always the manipulation of the king who was really on top. That will be the most astonishing thing in the end when the Mashiach arrives. When the Mashiach arrives, the Goyim are going to turn around and say, hey, how's this possible? How's this possible? We were the top guys, the top bananas. How's this possible? We control the world. Where did the Jews get all the strength from? The answer is, they got that strength because they were wrapped in the exile. While they were wrapped in the exile, they took all the strength they needed to survive. And they were then, and continued to be on the top, albeit a perverse top. You see, this is the mystery of the Jews. It's the greatest mystery of all. It's the mystery that the Jews can be at the bottom of the heap and really at the same time be at the top of the heap. You see, it is the mystery of the Jews and it is the undoing of the Goyim. Because no matter how far the Goyim go higher, no matter how far they achieve, they will never get to the top because they will always be at the bottom. In other words, it is always the situation of the reality where the Jews or the Torah or the Kedusha is always on top and the Tumah is always on the bottom. Except that what God does is turn it around so that it appears to be inverse. But it's only a fiction, an illusion. And when that tukul is removed, when the darkness is no longer necessary, because we will have removed it, suddenly the world will appear as it really is from its inside. And suddenly everything will right itself. And we will see what happened all along. Why does God do that? Is it the importance of the Jews that we're dealing with here? When we say all this, why is God doing all this? Why is He constructing this world in one way, and then if man doesn't succeed, He begins to initiate a series of activities to attempt to rectify the damage that man has done? Why? Because essentially, what is the ultimate objective of the world? The ultimate objective is that what God wants is that mankind should reside in an eternity. And the essential condition of that is that man should earn that eternity on his own. But what happens is many times man will falter, and what God will do is provide for man mechanisms and employments so that that task can continue. When Avraham Avinu, the first forefather, he had to go through 10 different trials or 10 different tribulations in order to prove himself worthy that from him should come the nation who will be involved in this holy task of building an Olam Haba. When he finished all of these 10, what God said to him, I will guarantee you, one way or another, that your children will in the end inherit Olam Haba. If the Jews merit this, if they merit a meticulous attention by God for preservation, it is because of the objective of God Himself, what He wants, and it's because of the great amount of effort that was performed by our forefathers, you see, and by our forefathers who were before us. Because of this, we the Jews, or descendants, have merited a continuous form of survival, you see. Because that's the extent that God has, that's the extent of the love that God has for the Jews, you see. In the sense that the Jews were the only nation in all time, especially the beginning time, who insisted on continuing the task of doing God's will. Through Avram, Yitzchak and Yaakov, through Moshe Rabbeinu, from one person after another, the Jews have always remained steadfast to do God's will. And even though there are times when they've fallen off the path, God says, I will do through my mercy and through my love of you and my promise to your forefathers, I will attempt to create different types of devices that you will survive. You see, that's why it's not so much the importance or the self-importance of the Jews. That's not what it really is. It's the objective that God has in mind. That God wants an aspect or a segment of mankind to earn an eternal life. You see, that's God's will. And that the Jews have demonstrated through their forefathers and so on, that they are a nation who are steadfast towards this objective. So God says, well, if that's the case, if they backslide once or twice, a couple of times, or in different generations, then I will constantly employ mechanisms to save them. But the essential mechanism that He employs, of course, is sorrow. It's what? Is misfortune. It's difficulties. It's sorrow for Jews. That's the problem. That's the mechanism that God has to employ to save the Jews in spite of themselves. You see. Why does He save the Jews in spite of themselves? Because of His own objective, number one. Number two, because of the fact how much He loves them. And number three, because of the merit and the tremendous amount of work that was done by the forefathers. And the promise of God Himself to them. That's the promise He made. That's the promise He made to Avram at the covenant of the pieces, the Bris Ben Absalom, that I will see to it, I will guarantee you that your children will eventually go into Olam Haba. And Avram himself says, well, how can you guarantee me that? So God says, I will create the mechanisms which are necessary to do that. You see, by virtue of the great merit in which you have accumulated, you and your forefathers themselves. You see, it's not. This is not. It is the greatness of God's love for the Jews. It is the greatness of the forefathers. It is the greatness of what Jews have been till now that motivates God. And it is the exalted position of His own objective, you see, to create another type of being who can enjoy and who can have a simcha or a joy for all eternity. That He can do good for that type of being. These are the things which motivate God, if I may use the term, to apply Rahmanas or mercy to the world. What I have simply done is simply try to explain what the mechanism of that was. That's all. You see. How does He do it? Can we have some kind of understanding of how He saves us, even though we sin? You see what I'm saying? That's what I'm most explored. But that's the fact. The fact is that even though the Jews are in the depths of an exile, they are still the most, who are most under God's watchful eye. And so that even the people who are the Goyim, who are the highest in the world today, you see, they have the power. That doesn't mean that the true power resides with them. It is an illusory power. The real power resides with those who God sees His ultimate objective with. And God has seen that the ultimate objective would be through the Jews, you see. Because they have received the Torah when all the other nations have turned it down. They have continued steadfast to God's will when all the nations have not. So God said, because of that loyalty to me, I will have a loyalty to you. You see, it's a reciprocal form of loyalty. But how does He do it? In order to do that, God must use the power of evil itself, you see, to do that. Why? Because the power of sin essentially takes away the power of a person. And that power then goes to the Satan. The only way to keep the person alive is to attach him to the Satan. Now, if you attach someone to the force of evil, it's painful. But that's the only way to keep you alive when you've got no energy on your own, you see. The other alternative would simply allow the power to evaporate. But then what would happen to the person? He would evaporate, you see. So it's better to keep the subject alive, albeit with a crutch, than not have the subject alive at all. And that crutch is called the power of evil. There are two key words in the Jewish language, in Jewish religion, Torah. One word is called emunah. You're supposed to have emunah in God. You're supposed to believe in God. And the second one is called betochen. You're supposed to trust in God. What is essentially the definition of both? This is the thing. You're supposed to believe in God. What kind of mitzvah is that? Emunah means belief in God. What does that mean? To believe in God means that even though you look at a world and you see goodness and pain, when you look at the world outside, what kind of picture comes to your mind? Do you see a world that's all good? No. Do you see a world that's all bad? No. You see a world where it's mixed. You see an incredible mixture of good and bad. So if you see a world where it's mixed of good and bad, and I say to you, who runs the world? Logically you would say, well, since there are good and bad, there must be two gods. Or two forces. Emunah says that even though the world has two different opposing forces of good and bad, there's only one God who's behind both. That's what Emunah says. Even though the world looks like it's chaotic, and the world looks like it doesn't have a specific cause and effect, because sometimes something is good, sometimes it's bad, it looks like it's random. It looks like there's two different forces running the world. Right? That's what it looks like. You must believe that there's only one force running the world, who is the God of Israel. That's what Emunah is. What is betochen? Betochen means to trust in God. Means it follows Emunah. Once you understand that even though the world is run or appears to be run by two different forces, and it's really run by only one God, the question is, what is the purpose of this two different forces? Okay, by Emunah, I accept the fact that there's only one God, even though the world looks like it has two different forces. Fine. What betochen says is that God has two forces because both of these forces are good.
You trust in God. What does it mean to trust? You know what trust means? When you trust someone, it means that you put your confidence that that person will not hurt you. That's what trust means. When you trust someone emotionally, or you trust your feelings to someone, essentially what it means, you're saying, I feel that this one's not going to hurt me. He's not going to take advantage of me. And whatever he does to me is for my own benefit. That's what real trust means. If you don't trust someone, it means that you're afraid that he's going to hurt you in some way. To trust someone means that you know that even though it doesn't look good or doesn't look right, you know that this person only means for your benefit. That's what betochen means. Betochen means that even though the world is filled with good and evil, even though your life is filled with good and evil, but trust God. The evil in your life is itself good. You see the two? So therefore, Amunah means to believe in one God, even though good and bad things happen to you. Betochen means believe and trust that the bad things that happen to you are ultimately for the good. That's the difference between Amunah and Betochen. You see, both are cardinal mitzvahs in the Torah. But now you understand how to perform these mitzvahs. You see, when you understand that in spite of all the different things that happen in the world, all the good and bad events, there is only one author and there's only one will behind that, you have reached the level called Emunah. There is only one God, despite the fact that the world is composed of many different forces. When you have reached the point that you understand that even the evil that is done, and even the darkness which is experienced, and even the bad things in your own life, somehow fulfills the will of God for the good, you have reached the level of Betochen. You see, those are the two technical definitions. Emunah and Betochen, they apply to different things, but they both, one follows the other. Betochen follows Emunah, and that's what it means. And it is not easy to have Emunah and Betochen. It is not easy to look out into the world outside there. It is not easy to look out into the American environment and believe that the Torah is the highest thing of all. It is not easy. You see, it is not easy. It is not easy to believe that keeping the mitzvahs is more important than anything which you see on the scene outside. Anything which the American environment can seduce you with all its wisdom and all its knowledge and all its power and all its material wealth and all its good times and its pleasures. Everything that they've got to offer out there, and they've got a lot to offer. It's not easy to say it's more important to do the Torah and mitzvahs. It's not easy. How can you say it then? Because you know that behind all of that, God resides. God is the power and the mind and the will behind all of that. And when God says that the Torah is the main thing, the Torah is the main thing. That's Emunah. But once you begin to learn Torah, and once you begin to what? To connect yourself to spirituality, you feel bad. Because you feel bad that the Torah is such a low position. You feel bad that the Goyim run the world, that materialism runs the world, that atheism runs the world, and so on and so forth. You feel terrible. You feel terrible because Ruchnis, the spirituality, is so far away. You see. So what do you do? Right? What do? You feel terrible. The answer is Betochen. That it has a reason. That there's a reason for it. It's not because God has abandoned the world or abdicated, but that in the very withdrawal of God, in the withdrawal itself, in the darkness, lies a reason for good. So that allows you to accept the inferior position of the Jews in the Torah today. You see that? That's Betochen. Because there is something in it, and something is going on right now, which will someday inverse the entire situation. That's Betochen. You see. But you cannot trust until you first believe, until you first understand. You first must understand what the world is about and what God's relationship is to the world. The second thing is you have to trust that even when it appears that things don't look good and things are not right, that it has a good purpose behind it, except that you cannot see it. You cannot see it. In the Messianic time, you will be able to see it. You will be able to understand the purpose and reason for every negative thing or bad thing that ever happened to you. You will understand why it happened to you, precisely, and you will understand how it was to your greatest benefit, even though it was painful.
you see. Because you will have understood that the alternative to that misfortune was annihilation. You will understand it experientially, emotionally, and you will feel it. That it is better to live and be somewhat deprived than not to live at all. So that someday you can become alive again with full stature, you see. Even if you have to go through a period of deprivation, at least you're alive. That's bitachon.